The message came in over a field radio at Tsuchin, a Japanese-held strip in southern China, on the afternoon of January 16, 1945. An American fighter had gone down nearby, not badly damaged. Japanese troops had already taken its pilot prisoner before he could reach for a match or a grenade. The radio operator who logged the report barely understood what he was describing. He noted the airframe's markings, its condition, and the detail that it looked whole enough to fly. 600 miles east, in a signals room at the Fussa Army Air Inspection Center outside Tokyo, a duty officer took the same message off a different line and began drafting the order that would send a man to retrieve it. That man was Major Yasuhiko Kuroe, a fighter pilot who had spent nearly 2 years in Burma with the 64th Sentai under Colonel Tateo Kato, one of the most storied unit commanders in the Japanese Army Air Service. Kuroe had fought the early Mustangs over Burma in November 1943, watched them climb away from fights his own aircraft could not follow into, and by the time the war reassigned him home to test and train pilots, he had earned a reputation as a man other pilots listened to. Across his career, he had been shot down and wounded 3 separate times and had gone back up anyway. He got the job of flying the American wreck, once it was patched together enough to fly, back across the country to the inspection center. The aircraft was a North American P-51C, serial 4410816, and the American ground crew that had maintained it called it Evalina after a girlfriend back home. Its pilot that day, a young second lieutenant named Sam McMillan, flying another man's airplane, spent the rest of the war in a Japanese prisoner camp. The record of his squadron's loss survives in the missing aircrew report filed for that mission, one document among thousands that nobody in either country would look at again for years. At Fussa, the engineers went over Evalina the way a jeweler goes over a stone. They logged the radio set, the gun sight, the self-sealing tanks, the armor plate behind the pilot's seat. Ground crews who had spent years wiping oil off the cowlings of their own aircraft after every sortie noted with something close to envy that the American engine underneath barely leaked at all. None of that surprised anyone for very long. Airframes could be measured, equipment could be photographed and copied, cockpits could be sat in and understood within an afternoon. The engine took longer. Under Evalina's cowling sat a Packard-built version of the Rolls-Royce Merlin, a 2-stage, 2-speed supercharged V12 of about 27 liters. Japan's closest equivalent, the liquid-cooled inline longefimes, the Army flew in the Kawasaki Ha-40, was the Ha-40, a license-built copy of the German Daimler-Benz DB601, running the same basic layout at nearly 34 liters, a third again the Merlin's size. On paper, the bigger engine should have carried the advantage. More room for fuel and air to burn on every stroke, more torque per revolution, a design that did not need to be pushed as hard to hit its numbers. And yet, the borrowed Mustang was outrunning and outclimbing the Ki-61 by a wide margin on an engine 2/3 its size. The engineers at Fussa could bore scope the cylinders, weigh the connecting rods, and time the valves, and none of it explained the gap. A smaller engine than Japan's own best inline was making far more power, and the difference was not sitting anywhere a micrometer could reach. Kuroe kept flying the airplane, first at Fussa and then at the Akeno Army Flying School, where it was thrown into mock combat against the Ki-43, the Ki-61, and the newer Ki-84 and Ki-100. So Japanese pilots could learn what it felt like to have a Mustang on their tail before they met one for real. His own account of those flights, recorded after the war, described a fighter that turned nearly as well as a Ki-84, dove faster than anything Japanese and held that speed without shaking apart, and carried equipment down to a radio direction finder that put Japanese cockpits to shame. One veteran instructor who flew it, Yohei Hinoki, had lost part of a leg to combat wounds years earlier and climbed into Evalina anyway. He said afterward that sitting in the cockpit alone told him how far ahead the design was before he ever left the ground. Whether either man ever said as much to a superior officer is not recorded. Ace pilots were not in the habit of volunteering how outclassed they had felt. During one round of trials, Kuroe ran the Mustang's fuel consumption against its range and did the math himself. He came away convinced that a fighter with these legs and flying out of a base like Iwo Jima could reach Tokyo and get home again. Nobody built a defense plan around that private arithmetic. It stayed a pilot's hunch, unwritten anywhere that mattered, filed away next to a study program that was itself running out of road. At the Navy's own equivalent research arsenal at Yokosuka, out of well over 300 personnel on staff, perhaps 10 officers and a dozen designers were assigned to the study of foreign aircraft at all. A handful of men working a problem, the United States ran through a dedicated technical intelligence unit staffed and funded as a wartime priority. Evalina herself did not outlast the year. Her generator failed sometime after the Akeno trials, and no replacement existed anywhere in the home islands. Some accounts say ground crews rolled her into a lake to get her out of the way. Others describe her as abandoned in a field and picked apart for spares. No photograph or wreckage after the middle of 1945 has ever turned up to settle, which is true. Measuring a stranger's engine explains what it is. It does not explain what it was fed. American technical manuals, some of them pulled from captured airfields and downed aircraft, described grades of aviation gasoline with no real Japanese counterpart. Fuel graded 100 over 130, a shorthand for how much detonation it could resist at lean and rich mixture, with a still higher 150 grade, reaching some frontline units by the war's last year. Tetraethyl lead drove almost the whole of that rating. The additive let an engine run far higher supercharger boost and therefore far higher power without the mixture igniting early and hammering a piston apart from the inside. A bigger cylinder only pays off if an engine can cram more into it before the charge ignites, and American fuel let engineers cram in a great deal more. Japanese engineers had begun fitting their own late-war engines with water and methanol injection to fight the same problem from the other direction, cooling the charge enough to resist knock on inferior fuel. None of it closed the gap. What Japan had instead, by the time anyone might have pieced this together, was a fuel program in open collapse. Nakajima had designed the Homare radial in its newest fighters around 91 octane gasoline, the standard available in 1941. By 1944, the air services were feeding it 87 octane instead. And in the war's final months, refineries stretched whatever they could still produce with oil distilled from pine tree stumps. Schoolchildren and conscripted laborers dug up those stumps by the tens of thousands under a program Imperial General Headquarters had promised would fuel the coming decisive battle. The effort produced roughly 3,000 barrels of usable aviation fuel from some 70,000 barrels of raw pine oil, fuel contaminated enough that American jeeps running on leftover stocks after the surrender broke down from it. A country reduced to growing its aviation fuel out of tree stumps was never going to out-refine an opponent running 17 high-octane plants at once. On the morning of April 7th, 1945, 96 P-51 Mustangs lifted off the black volcanic runways of Iwo Jima, formed up with more than 100 B-29 superfortresses over open ocean, and turned north for Honshu. Their target was the Nakajima Aircraft Engine Works on the western edge of Tokyo, the same firm whose own radial engines were starved at that exact moment for the fuel they needed. It was the first time a land-based American fighter had ever appeared over the Japanese capital at the end of a round trip of roughly 1,500 miles that planners in Tokyo had spent years insisting no single-engine aircraft could fly. The fighters that rose to meet the bombers that day met an opponent faster at altitude than anything in the defender's own inventory, one that broke up the interception before it ever reached the bomber stream. The American fighter command that flew the mission counted more than 70 enemy planes destroyed or damaged against a handful of its own Mustangs lost. It was the first of 51 such missions that command would fly against the home islands before the war ended in August.